After the end of the war, more than half of the German population found themselves in undesirable situations and out of their places of origin. This included about 9 million people who had been bombed and evacuated, 14 million refugees and exiles, 10 million freed forced laborers and prisoners, as well as an uncountable number of prisoners of war who were slowly returning. How was this crowd of disheveled, displaced, and impoverished people dismantled and reintegrated? And how did the former national comrades, Volksgenossen, as German citizens were known during the Nazi regime, gradually resume their lives as ordinary citizens? These are questions that run the risk of being forgotten in the face of the magnitude of historical events. The most significant changes occurred in daily life, such as in food organization, looting, currency exchanges, and shopping. In addition, issues related to love emerged as a period of fleeting sexual relations followed the war. There was great disappointment when the long-awaited husbands did not return home. However, many Germans began to see things differently, longing for a new beginning, which led to a significant increase in divorce rates. Today we'll take a detailed look at what Germany and its people were like a decade after the end of World War II. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed the topic. The collective memory of the post-war period in Germany is marked by some images that left a strong impression in people's minds. The Russian soldier ripping a bicycle from a woman's hands, sinister black market figures gathering around a few eggs, temporary barracks sheltering refugees and people whose homes had been bombed, and women holding photos of their missing husbands, questioning the returning prisoners of war. These visually powerful images became fixed in the German public memory of the first post-war years, like an unchangeable silent film. Although it is important to note that half of the story ends up in the editing room. While memory usually wraps the past in a softer light as the years go by, the opposite is true for the post-war period in Germany. Over time, it became increasingly somber. One of the reasons for this lies in the widespread need among Germans, who were not persecuted by the Nazi regime, to see themselves, nevertheless, as victims. Many people felt that the darker the accounts of the truly dreadful winters of famine in 1946 and 1947, the smaller their guilt would seem. However, if we pay attention, it is also possible to catch glimpses of laughter. A spontaneous Rosenmontag carnival procession passed through a terribly depopulated Cologne as early as 1946. Journalist Margaret Bovary recalled the feeling that life was enormously heightened by the looming proximity of death. During the years when there was nothing to buy, she was so content that she decided not to make major purchases even when things improved. Misery cannot be understood without the pleasure it provokes. Escaping death led some to apathy, while others developed a passionate love for life. The established order of things had been dismantled, families broken up, connections lost, but people were beginning to reconnect, and the young and spirited viewed the chaos as a playground where they sought out their joy anew every day. The Holocaust had a surprisingly small presence in the consciousness of most Germans in the post-war period. Some acknowledged the crimes that had occurred on the Eastern Front and felt a certain fundamental guilt for having started the war, but many simply could not integrate the mass murder of millions of German and European Jews into their thoughts and emotions. Only a few people, such as philosopher Karl Jaspers, publicly addressed the issue. The Jews were not even explicitly mentioned in the widely discussed guilt declarations of the Protestant and Catholic churches in August 1945. Insidiously, the unimaginable nature of the Holocaust also infiltrated the consciousness of the nation that perpetrated it. The crimes were of such immense magnitude that they were expelled from the collective consciousness, even while they were still happening. The fact that even well-meaning people refused to consider the fate of their deported neighbors severely undermined trust in humanity to this day. And most Germans of the time bore the guilt of this omission. the concealment of extermination camps persisted even after the war's end, despite the Allies' efforts to forcibly confront the defeated German people with evidence of Nazi crimes. Post-war Chancellor Helmut Kohl used the sarcastic phrase, "the blessing of late birth," to suggest that the younger generation had no right to feel morally superior to the previous one. However, there was also the blessing of experiencing terror. The nights of air raids, the severe famine winters of the early post-war years, and the intense struggle for survival in conditions of everyday chaos prevented many Germans from reflecting on the past. They saw themselves as victims and therefore had the ambiguous fortune of not needing to face the truth. Because if they still had a shred of decency after all that had happened, if they were aware of the systematic mass murder committed in their name, with their implicit support, and due to their willingness to close their eyes, they would hardly have had the courage and energy to survive the post-war years. The survival instinct softened feelings of guilt, a collective phenomenon that was studied in the years after 1945, and that should be deeply disturbing to those who still believe in humanity. Although works like The Diary of Anne Frank or The SS State by Eugen Kogon interrupted the process of repression, it was only with the start of the Auschwitz trials in 1963 that many Germans began to confront the crimes committed in their name. In the eyes of the younger generation, Germans had brought extreme dishonor upon themselves by postponing the trials, even though, in material terms, they had benefited considerably from their parents' capacity for repression. Rarely in history has a generational conflict been waged with such bitterness, anger, and self-confidence as that of the German youth of 1968 against their parents. Today, the general impression of the German people regarding the post-war years is shaped by the perspective of those who were young at the time. The anti-authoritarian anger that children felt toward their parents' generation, a generation that did not become easy to love, was so intense, their criticism so eloquent, that the myth of a suffocating layer of outdatedness that needed to be eliminated still dominates the image of the 1950s held by most Germans, despite more sophisticated historical research. The generation born around 1950 took pride in the role it played in making the Federal Republic West Germany livable and in giving democracy a heart, and this image continues to be promoted by that generation. However, during that period, there remained a strong presence of the old Nazi elite in the offices of the Federal Republic, which caused disgust in many, as well as the ease with which Nazi criminals were granted amnesty. Despite this, the post-war era in Germany was marked by intense energy, a more open life, more critical intellectuals, a wide variety of opinions, more innovative art, and a more contradictory daily life than the impressions that have prevailed from 1968 to the present might suggest. There is another reason why the first 4 years of the post-war period in Germany represent a relative blind spot in historical memory. Among the major chapters and research topics of history, they form a kind of vacuum for which, in general, no one assumes responsibility. A major chapter in German school history deals with the Nazi regime, ending with the capitulation of the German Wehrmacht, while the next one, which begins in 1949, tells the story of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, focusing at best on the currency reform and the Berlin blockade as background to the founding of the two states. The years between the end of the war and the currency reform, the great economic breakthrough of the Federal Republic, are, in a way, a period neglected by historiography, as they lack a defined institutional subject. The writing of German history continues to be essentially structured as a national history, placing the state as the central political subject. However, starting in 1945, 4 political centers, Washington, Moscow, London, and Paris, were responsible for German history, each exercising authority over its designated occupation zone, which made it difficult to construct a consistent national narrative. classroom assessment of the crimes committed against Jews and forced laborers generally ends with the liberation of the survivors by Allied soldiers. However, what happened to them after that? And what happened to the approximately 10 million starving prisoners uprooted from their homelands and now abandoned without supervision in the land of their torturers and murderers? How did they react? The dynamic between the Allied soldiers, the defeated Germans, and the freed forced laborers is one of the saddest yet most fascinating aspects of the post-war years. As the consequences unfold, the focus shifts from the social aspects of daily life, such as cleaning, romantic relationships, theft, and shopping, to cultural aspects, intellectual life, and the flourishing of a new radical visual aesthetic. Here, questions of conscience, guilt, and repression are examined more incisively. The cases of denazification, which also had aesthetic components, are treated with care. The remarkable lasting fame of the arts, encompassing architecture, painting, among others, of the 1950s, can be attributed to a surprising factor. The transformation of the environment led Germans to change themselves. However, the question arises whether the Germans were really the only ones responsible for so radically transforming the appearance of the world around them. A dispute over design concepts and abstract art emerged, in which the occupying powers, United States, Britain, France, and Russia, exerted influence. This concerned the decorative aesthetics of the two German republics, contrasting the socialist realism of the East with the abstract art of the West, shaping the perception of beauty during the Cold War. Even the CIA was involved in this context. More than today, Germans had a tendency to present themselves as refined, sophisticated, and deeply immersed in serious discussions, as if it were possible to perfectly rescue the manners of the 19th century, which had been transformed into the good old days. Today, we know a lot about the Holocaust. However, what we know less about is how life in Germany continued under the shadow it cast over the country's future. How does a nation in whose name many millions of people were murdered deal with questions of culture and morality? Would it be better, for the sake of decency, to avoid speaking about decency altogether? Let the children discover for themselves what is good and what is bad. In the years immediately following the war, media analysts were engaged, along with other institutions, in the reconstruction of society. Everyone was desperately seeking meaning. Philosophizing about the ruins of existence meant searching for meaning, just as many limited themselves to searching for remains among the rubble. Holocaust survivors. In 1945, when Allied troops entered the concentration camps, they found piles of people who had been killed, testimony to the mass murder committed by the Nazis. The soldiers also discovered thousands of Jewish and non-Jewish survivors suffering from hunger and disease. For the survivors, the prospect of rebuilding their lives was daunting. After liberation, many Jewish survivors feared returning to their former homes due to the anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews that persisted in parts of Europe, and the trauma they had endured. Some who did return home feared for their lives. In post-war Poland, for example, there were a series of pogroms, violent riots against Jews. The largest of these occurred in the city of Kielce in 1946, when Polish rioters killed at least 42 Jews and injured many others. With few possibilities for emigration, tens of thousands of homeless Holocaust survivors migrated westward to other European territories liberated by the Western Allies. There, they were housed in hundreds of refugee centers and displaced persons camps, such as Bergen-Belsen in Germany. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, and the occupying armies of the United States, Britain, and France administered these camps. A considerable number and variety of Jewish agencies worked to assist Jewish displaced persons. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee provided Holocaust survivors with food and clothing, while the Organization for Rehabilitation through Training offered vocational training. Refugees also formed their own organizations, and many worked toward the establishment of an independent Jewish state in Palestine. The largest survivors organization, Sheret HaPleta, Hebrew for Surviving Remnant, pushed for greater opportunities for emigration. However, opportunities for legal immigration to the United States beyond existing quota restrictions were still limited. The British restricted immigration to Palestine. Many borders in Europe were also closed to these homeless people. The Jewish Brigade Group, a Palestinian Jewish unit of the British Army, was formed in late 1944. Together with displaced former partisan fighters in Central Europe, the Jewish Brigade Group created the Briha, Hebrew for escape or flight. This organization aimed to facilitate the exodus of Jewish refugees from Europe to Palestine. Jews already living in Palestine organized illegal immigration by ship, also known as Aliyah Bet. However, British authorities intercepted and returned most of these vessels. In 1947, the British forced the ship Exodus 1947, which was carrying 4,500 Holocaust survivors en route to Palestine to return to Germany. In most cases, the British detained Jewish refugees denied entry to Palestine in detention camps on the Mediterranean island of Cyprus. With the establishment of the State of Israel in May 1948, displaced and refugee Jews began to migrate to the new sovereign state. Possibly around 170,000 displaced and refugee Jews had immigrated to Israel by 1953. In December 1945, President Harry Truman issued a directive that relaxed immigration quota restrictions for the United States for persons displaced by the Nazi regime. Under this directive, more than 41,000 displaced persons immigrated to the United States. Approximately 28,000 were Jews. In 1948, the United States Congress passed the Displaced Persons Act. The law provided approximately 400,000 immigration visas to the United States for displaced persons between January 1, 1949 and December 31, 1952. Of the 400,000 displaced persons who entered the U.S. under the Displaced Persons Act, approximately 68,000 were Jews. Other Jewish refugees in Europe emigrated as displaced persons or refugees to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, Mexico, South America, and South Africa. If we now turn the prism and take a look at the relations between East Germany and West Germany, we see that under Chancellor Adenauer, West Germany declared its right to speak on behalf of the entire German nation with an exclusive mandate. The Hallstein Doctrine, which was the doctrine that governed West Germany, involved the non-recognition of East Germany and restricted, or often cut off, diplomatic relations with countries that granted East Germany sovereign state status. The constant flow of East Germans fleeing across the internal German border to West Germany placed great strain on relations between the two in the 1950s. East Germany sealed its borders with West Germany in 1952, but people continued to flee from East Berlin to West Berlin. On August 13, 1961, East Germany began constructing the Berlin Wall around West Berlin to reduce the flow of refugees to a trickle, effectively cutting the city in half and turning West Berlin into an enclave of the Western world in communist territory. The wall became the symbol of the Cold War and the division of Europe. Shortly afterward, the main border between the two German states was fortified. In 1969, Chancellor Willy Brandt announced that West Germany would remain firmly rooted in the Atlantic Alliance, but would intensify efforts to improve relations with the Eastern Bloc, especially East Germany. West Germany's relations with East Germany raised particularly difficult questions. Although eager to ease serious hardships for divided families and reduce friction, West Germany under Brandt's Ostpolitik was determined to maintain its concept of two German states within one German nation. Relations gradually improved. In the early 1970s, Ostpolitik led to a form of mutual recognition between East and West Germany. The Moscow Treaty, August 1970, the Warsaw Treaty, December 1970, the Four-Power Agreement on Berlin, September 1971, the Transit Agreement, May 1972, and the Basic Treaty, December 1972, helped normalize relations between East and West Germany and led both states to join the United Nations in September 1973. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.